So good afternoon, Shamla. So
Hi,
excited
Pam.
to have you here today. Thank you so much for your valuable time. This is our first interview series for the Roundtable Network. And it's really all about, board and preparing for the board meetings and executing well in the board meetings. And I think the first place we should start is just letting you introduce yourself.
Hi. Thank you for having me, Pam. My name is Shamla Naidoo. I'm currently a managing partner in IBM Security. However, I've spent 38 years in various technology and technology-related roles, including 2 decades as a CISO. Most recently, I was the global CISO for IBM for 4 years, and now I've spent the last 2 years working with the C-suite, CEOs, and boards of our customers, helping them to think about security in a more strategic way.
Excellent. Wow. Perfect. This is spot on for this conversation. Maybe we start at like a 10,000 foot level and talk about what is the CISO's ultimate responsibility to the board?
I think the CISO's single responsibility to the board is to manage risk. Just if you think about it, the board's responsibility is to manage risk for the organization and for the shareholders. And if you just think about how they do that, they can endorse the strategy. They can provide, feedback and input. But ultimately, the board's responsibility is to manage the risk in the organization, in the risk in the strategy. And so the CISO's job as a risk leader fits perfectly into the board agenda for managing risk. But of course, there's all kinds of ways you think about managing risk, right? They're not managing operational risk. They're not managing technical risk. For the most part, the board is looking at the strategy and the risk with respect to that strategy and how this company will grow and evolve. So the CISO really needs to think about, how do I put that cybersecurity risk in the context of that strategic and business risk, so that the board understands exactly what the impact is to this business strategy that they may have just endorsed.
Very good. So it makes sense, but sometimes it's hard to break it down on how to communicate that risk. Do you find that there's a methodology or a format that tends to work? I know every company is different. Every culture is different. Every board has a different level of education around cyber even. But is there some methodology that you find is a great way a methodology that would be good to follow, or format or framework?
Here's what I would say, to a CISO who's thinking about, how do I frame the conversation with the board, is there's no single methodology. I think every organization is going to be different for sure. Every culture is going to be different about how they think about risk, how they approach risk, etc. However, you might have a unique format, but when you find that unique format, stick with it. Consistency is extremely important to the board, because remember, when we prepare for board meetings, what do? We go back and we see, what did you tell us last time? And then we say, what are you telling us now? And how do we bridge the gap? So that consistency in format, consistency in structure is extremely important. And there's, of course, we know that the content will change, but that consistency is important, because what it then does for your board directors, it helps them to focus on the content. When the format changes each time, they have to go back and ask questions like, why is he or she telling me this? What should I do about this? How should I think about this? And what you don't want is that distraction in that kind of different format that comes up each time. What you want them to do is to focus on your content. So, consistency is important. Find that content. And frankly, if you're not sure what works, ask the question. Put a format out there and then say, I'm assuming that this format works for you. If not, let me know. Is there anything I can do about this differently? Remember that, the board is in the same position as the CISOs, right? They also don't know what you're thinking. They're using your update and your content to figure out what you're thinking and what you may need. So entering into that dialogue is extremely important.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Absolutely. Don't be afraid to just ask. So, I think that one of the topics that comes up with my CISOs a lot is what is too much information? Like what's too much detail for them? Do you find that you can, create a rat hole or kind of get too in the weeds? Um, how do you keep it up leveled enough, but yet detailed enough for it to be valuable?
So all detail is too much detail for the
Okay, I got that.
and I know that sounds so strange, but all detail is too much detail.
Yeah.
Let me tell you how I did this and how I think about it and what I want as a board director, right? Is this is an opportunity for you to showcase highlights. So, I would say describe what you're telling me versus telling me, because the board director lacks the context for where does your particular update fit in the bigger scheme of the business strategy. So if you describe it and you highlight specific areas and you describe what this is, that's more powerful and valuable than the detail. Because when you give me the detail, I now have to connect the dots with where does this detail fit in the bigger picture of the strategy.
Mhm.
So I think too much detail, all detail is too much detail. Too much detail can confuse and can, create a redirection of the key messages. So think about this as a show of highlights. What are
Mhm.
the key things that you want those board directors to take away and remember?
Yeah, I like that. Excellent. Good point. All details, too much detail. That's perfectly said. Um, but it leads me to this question. I actually asked my group this question last quarter, and it was an interesting answers. But what question does the board ask that you wish you had a better answer for? And one of the things that came back commonly was, do you have everything you need? So, two questions, I guess, on this. One is, how do you handle questions where there's going to be questions, especially in security, because there's not always a perfect answer. How do you handle questions where you don't have the right answer or an answer that you feel confident about? And really, how do you answer the question, do you have everything you need?
I would say that is a landmine. And so CEOs have to be extremely careful when you step on that landmine, right? Because the question is often asked extremely innocently, because for the most part, remember, a board update includes all kinds of, measures and metrics from the organization. And so, they used to seeing this model of more is better. The more money I make, the better it is. The lower my expenses, the better that is. And so, think about that model, but we operate in a very different model. So when they ask that question, it is in that context of, if I give you two more people, or if I give you two more machines, can you make more widgets? And can you then generate more income or more revenue? Right? So think about it in that context. So for the security question, though, that answer is not as simple. If they gave us two more people or two more machines, we're not necessarily going to get a better result or a better
Right.
outcome.
Mhm.
Chances are we will, but that's not, we know that, right? That's not scientific. So that question, I think, is a landmine for a couple reasons. When they say, do you have everything you need? We will never, for our strategy, have everything we need, ever. We could blow through the entire organization's budget and
Yeah.
we still could be left with gaps and issues and things that we didn't anticipate or couldn't have foreseen, right? So that, like I said, that's a landmine question. We have to learn how to answer that, though, And I think, being honest is really important, but being honest with context is helpful. So, if you don't have what you need because you've asked for it and the answer is no, well, then we have to be able to talk about that. But remember that when we bring those kinds of conversations up, we have to have exhausted every opportunity in the organization before you take that kind of conversation to the board. Okay?
Yeah.
So, and remember that it stops at the CEO. So unless you've talked to the CEO and said, I must have these two people or these two machines, or else I cannot fulfill my obligation, that shouldn't get to the board.
Right. I like that. Very
That
good.
escalation is important, and it's also respectful. Right? It says that
Yeah.
you're a good leader, you're a strong leader, you have exhausted every opportunity to resolve this issue, and now you're raising it in the board.
So, that makes me think of a kind of a follow-on question of, are there are there things that the CISO should get a nod from the board before doing?
Never. Here's
Okay.
we have to make the distinction of what does the board do versus what does the C-suite, the CEO, the CIO, and other executives in the company do. The board is not there to make decisions for your day-to-day operational role.
Mhm.
They endorse the strategy. Believe it or not, they don't even create the business strategy, right? They endorse the business strategy. So all of that kind of function is left with the organization's leadership.
Good. Yeah.
So making the distinction, you never go to the board to ask for permission, to ask for approval, to ask for resources, or your ask should be to your C-suite.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah, makes total
Now,
sense.
it's also perfectly acceptable to say to the board, I'm using this approach to manage the strategic risk.
Mhm.
If you have any feedback or any input, I would appreciate that. Or to say, do you endorse this, or can you endorse this?
Mhm. Yeah, it's a different way of positioning the question. I get it. Yeah. And so, the other thing that comes up, I think, is how much do you educate? I mean, I think it's important to educate about the threat landscape, but the threat landscape is pretty darn broad. So do you pick a topic for each board meeting, or is it just what, like, obviously solar winds comes up a lot right now. The board members are asking about it still. Um, so how do you educate on the threat landscape, or do you have a strategy there?
Security leaders have two key responsibilities, I think. One is to be an influencer in the organization, to influence behavior and influence activity and priorities. The second is to be an educator, and educating at all levels, right? We do security awareness, we do security training. Why won't we take that same concept and use it in the boardroom? So that whole idea of the threat landscape, I think it helps when we contextualize it and reduce it into a set of educational steps that we want to leave the board directors with. So we want to make them smarter. And when we leave the room, we want to leave them with a few extra nuggets, right? And so I do think that that educator role is critical. Talking about the threat landscape might actually instill a little bit of fear. So the important thing is to take the threat landscape and use it as content in that educator role.
Excellent. Okay, great. I know that you have a lot of these conversations. One of your roles at IBM is educating boards on cyber, mentoring CISOs. Uh, what are some of the common questions that you get? Because I'm sure that would be helpful context for my group.
I'll tell you the most common question is, what did he or she expect us to do about that? Fill in the blank, right?
Yeah.
And so we have to think really carefully about what do we want from the board? And it doesn't hurt to kick off with, I'm giving you this update because I want, fill in the blank, or I want, or this is just an FYI, or this is for the purpose of just giving you some more color or some more context. And so I think it's really important that CISOs talk about the why. Why are we telling you what we're telling you? Why did I include this in my update versus something else in my update? The why is more important for the boards than the what or the how. When you asked about the detail, right? We put a lot of how detail in our updates, and the how can confuse. So it's really important, I think, when you talk it, and it's not just at the board level, it's also at the CEO. When you talk
Mhm.
about the CEO level, you really have to talk about why. Why am I bringing this particular issue to you at this particular time? And what specific action do I want from you? And I think that same model should extend to the board. It's perfectly okay to say, I'm only giving you this as a piece of information that will help you understand our security posture, or help you understand how I'm spending my time, or help you understand how we're making investments.
Right.
But the why is an extremely important part of those conversations to fill in the gap on, the question that I get asked, which is, what am I supposed to do with this information they've just given me?
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. And and on that same kind of questioning, what mistake, so that's a common question that you get, but what common mistakes do you see made?
Budget conversations. Budget conversations should never be included in a security update because the board doesn't decide whether to approve or not approve your budget request. That's for the CFO.
Yeah. Right.
So that whole idea of trying to make your business case is probably the biggest mistake a CISO will make in the boardroom.
Interesting. Okay, good. Well, this has just been a great conversation. I hope I'm confident that my group will find benefit in these pointers. Any final thoughts before we close?
So interestingly, I'm going to be speaking at an NACD conference next week, which is the
Oh,
North
there you
America
go. Yeah.
Directors Conference. One of the things that I want to tell them is to stop asking these questions in the board as though these are new topics. So, for example, SolarWinds, right? SolarWinds may have been a slight exception to the rule because they came out so quickly. But the fact is that the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, they don't create and define the CISO strategy. So when by the time the board reads these particular topics or issues in the newspaper, it's a little late, right?
Yeah.
Because we as CISOs and security leaders, we've probably already transcended those topics. We've already handled it, managed it. We already have, a plan and a strategy, and maybe we've even executed the plan and the strategy. So it's important that they understand that when they ask these questions, these are not new things because most, you know, uh, security leaders today, we're not relying on the Wall Street Journal to determine and define our security strategy and approach.
Right.
So, that's one thing I want to share with them because when they talk about this, they spend a lot of boardroom real estate on topics that may have already kind of outlived their useful lifetime.
Yeah, makes total sense. Right. By the time they get to the board meeting, it's almost old news, right? Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
But there's still value in us using those examples for education.
Mhm. Right, right. I know one of the things came up was, how do we avoid being involved in another solar winds, or even, even if they weren't part of that breach, how do you avoid, uh, supply chain issues? Because they're so difficult, right? Third party. Yeah.
They are, and I'll tell you one other thing that's really important, right? Where CISO wants to establish their credibility in the boardroom, and you asked earlier about those difficult questions. You may not have every answer to the difficult question. However, if you don't, you say so, right? But you don't end there. You say, this is a difficult question, and we don't yet have an answer. And oh, by the way, I've talked to my peers at, this industry or this organization, or I've talked to, this industry group. And frankly, we all struggling with the same issue. None of us have a good solution. Or we say, company ABC has a really great solution, but they are the exception to the rule. It's because, whatever they've done that's unique or different. And I think that actually establishes credibility, because what it says is, I don't have the answer, but it's not that I don't have the answer because I don't know how to do my job. I don't have the answer because that's a difficult question. And here's other credible peers in the industry
Yeah.
that are struggling with the same question and still in the same place as we are. And oh, by the way, as the industry moves and as it evolves, and as more experts have more solutions, I will embrace those solutions and, or modify our approach, etc. So for example, the SolarWinds question, right? If the biggest and the best and the brightest were not able to manage this, there's a good chance that it doesn't matter what we do, we're not going to be able to manage it today until we come back together as an industry and figure out ways to solve this third-party problem. Because unless we unbundle every piece of software and inspect every line of code, we're not going to solve this problem. But there will probably be some techniques that we can all embrace. And as that happens, we'll all learn together and we'll evolve and we'll adapt our security approach. So I think those are important considerations, is what are others doing?
Yeah.
Why am I in this situation? Am I alone?
Right. And
Or
also
am I
reassuring them that you are having discussions, whether it's inside your vertical or just across, large enterprise, and getting validation points, I think is important. And I've also seen some of my CISOs bring experts to the table, maybe even somebody like yourself, and I think it's important that if you do that, in a very partnered way, right? In a very planned way. But bringing experts to the table in cyber can also be another strategy potentially. Do you agree?
I do. And for the most part, it's not a different message, and it should never be a counter message. What it really should be is, a validation of, this is
Mhm.
what we see in the industry. This is what we see more broadly. So this is not a unique situation, because for a board, they're looking at their strategy, they're looking at their issues and thinking these risks only exist here. And so having an industry expert can broaden their point of view to say, I'm validating what this leader is telling you. This is what we see elsewhere, is a very valuable exercise. Also, my thinking is that a different voice can sometimes get different listening ears.
Yeah. Well said. I love that.
Yeah.
Well, I know we're kind of out of time, but thank you, Shamla, for your great insights. I so appreciate it. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Thank
thank you.